report is coming out in the failings of the Toronto Police Service in 10 missing person cases is about to be tabled at a news conference. 8 of the cases examined by the Justice Gloria Epstein were the victims of serial killer Bruce McArthur. Epstein concludes there were profound systemic failures by police in many areas, from the investigations themselves to communications with the families and the broader communities that the victims were a part of. Let's go live now to that news conference in Toronto and listen.
Communities, particularly those most marginalized and vulnerable. The time was right for several reasons. First, much has been said publicly about what the police did and did not do. I found some of it to be untrue. These untruths cause me great concern. The public is entitled to know the truth. So are the loved ones and friends of those who went missing. In some instances, providing an accurate account of what happened exposes serious investigative flaws or a lack of attention that made these cases more difficult to solve. In other instances, an accurate account corrects a narrative that is simply unfair to investigators. The Toronto Police are also entitled to know what they did well and what they did poorly. Despite the profound systemic failures I identify in the report, some excellent work was done by some dedicated officers. That account must also be provided through an objective, independent assessment. As well, the ward is entitled to know what should change and why. Second, the role of the police in our society and their relationship with diverse communities is now at the forefront of public discourse. This discourse is long overdue. An examination of missing person investigations contributes to a larger conversation, one that is about the role of police in serving our diverse communities and whether the police should be performing roles currently given to them. But we are past the time for conversation only. The public is entitled to insist on transformative change with measurable, sustainable outcomes, timelines for completion, and accountability. The review I led over the past 31 months has examined an enormous amount of evidence, has made findings on the basis of that evidence, findings that include serious flaws in how missing person cases have been handled in Toronto, and not just the ones identified in the terms of reference. And I have made recommendations, 51 recommendations that propose ways to address these flaws. The recommendations include a new approach to missing person investigations, a model that draws on recent changes for the better, and advocates a new approach to missing person cases generally. This new approach takes some of the investigations, or certain components of them, away from the police, and where warranted, encourages much greater use of civilians and social agencies. The review was largely prompted by concerns that the McArthur-related investigations were infected by bias. Some community members feel that Toronto police remained uninterested in the disappearances of McArthur's victims. That is, until Andrew Kinsman, who is not a person of color, was reported missing. Many members of the service rejected this view, pointing to the number of dedicated officers who worked tirelessly to solve these cases. That is true. However, the full narrative must take into consideration bias, discrimination, and differential treatment, particularly when it is rooted in the service's existing systems and practices. Our goal must be to ensure that no one is treated in a less adequate way because of marginalization and vulnerabilities, whether based on sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, color, ethnic origin, immigration status, homelessness or being underhoused, socioeconomic status or mental health, or on a combination of these demographics. Some officers had misconceptions or stereotypical ideas about the LGBTQ2S+ communities. At times, their perceptions impeded their work. Many were unaware of community resources as well as the service's own resources that could assist in advancing their investigations into those who went missing from marginalized and vulnerable communities. Indeed, the failure of the police to keep the public informed about what they were doing reinforced the broadly held impression within Toronto's diverse communities that the police did nothing. In my opinion, none of these issues, all existing at a systemic level, depends on any intent to discriminate. To the credit of Andrew Kinsman's friends and loved ones, they mobilized in a highly public way to ensure the police gave Mr. Kinsman's disappearance the attention it deserved. However, proper missing person investigations should not depend on whose voices are the loudest or most empowered in sounding the alarm. This observation represents yet another systemic issue I identify in my report. Many things became clear to me during my work. One was that many marginalized and vulnerable people deeply mistrust the police. In my view, the board and the service must now begin a new process to improve missing person investigations and to restore the missing trust. A process rooted in concrete, transparent, and strategic plans with defined deliverables and timelines, in full partnership with communities and accompanied by accountability measures described in my report. Before I say more about the report itself, I want to briefly comment on the work that went into it. At the outset, I created the Community Advisory Group, a highly diverse group of community leaders who worked to ensure that all voices were heard. In our regular meetings, they provide me with advice and guidance and were directly involved in the design and implementation of the review's public outreach and engagement plan. I personally met with many stakeholder groups and hundreds of people, a number of them more than once. These meetings took place in their own community spaces to promote a safe and supportive environment in which they could share their lived experiences and their perspectives. Sometimes I did so one-on-one to preserve their confidentiality. No request to meet at any time or any location was turned down. It was important that I not only meet with those who work with marginalized and vulnerable communities, but also directly with those most vulnerable, such as the homeless and those addressing mental health issues. About 1,000 community members participated in an anonymous online survey. In August of 2020, 33 community leaders and policing experts from around the globe participated in a policy roundtable to provide their perspectives and recommendations on systemic issues identified by the review. Then in October 2020, the review held a public town hall. Of course, all of these events were done remotely since the pandemic intervened. My team and I conducted many interviews. These interviews included friends and loved ones of those who had gone missing, Toronto police officers of all ranks, civilian employees, local, national, and international experts or specialists in many areas relevant to the review's work, community leaders and service providers, members of the Toronto Police Association, employees of the Ministry of the Solicitor General and the Chief Coroner's Office, as well as Ontario's Chief Coroner and Chief Forensic Pathologist's offices, 2 chairs, and the Executive Director of the board, and many more. I will remember every interview I conducted, none more so than the time I spent with Michael Wells, Laura Wells's father, as he described his experience in reporting his daughter's disappearance to the police. Professor Kent Roach served as the review's research director. Under the leadership of Professor Roach, the review commissioned papers from leading academics on issues relevant to my mandate. The review also collected much relevant literature from around the world. In essence, the report addresses two related issues. One, how to conduct and oversee missing person investigations, especially those involving marginalized and vulnerable communities, many of whose members distrust the police due to a range of legacy and ongoing issues I describe in my report. The second theme focuses on building and strengthening relationships between the Toronto Police and Toronto's marginalized and vulnerable communities. I document the issues that have frayed the relationship between the service and those communities, the initiatives the service and the board and the city have introduced to address those issues, and what needs to change. I repeat what I said at the beginning of my remarks. I conclude that many of the investigations I examined were seriously flawed. Those flaws reflected a range of systemic issues. I also conclude that systems and practices that were in place discriminate against the LGBTQ2S+ communities and marginalized and vulnerable communities generally. This conclusion is not dependent on any finding of overt or intentional discrimination. As reflected in current jurisprudence that addresses discrimination and by the Ontario Human Rights Commission's approach to discrimination, the focus must be on the effects of police systems and practices. I acknowledge the service's considerable efforts in the aftermath of the investigations I examined to upgrade missing person investigations, most particularly in the creation of a centralized missing persons unit. However, missing person investigations still do not get the priority and the attention they deserve. These investigations continue to be severely under-resourced, an issue that is deeply troubling given the disproportionate number of marginalized and vulnerable people who go missing and who are exposed to risks while they are gone. Moreover, barriers that prevent some vulnerable people from being reported missing to the police are equally concerning. The report recognizes that many missing person cases have little to do with law enforcement, but everything to do with social issues, marginalization, and vulnerabilities. That is why I propose a model drawn upon practices that exist elsewhere, including internationally, that builds capacity for social service, public health, and community agencies to address a number of missing person cases, sometimes through a multidisciplinary approach that includes the police and sometimes does not include the police. This new model reflects a holistic approach to missing person cases, true community partnership in addressing them, and greater use of civilians within the service to coordinate cases and support those directly affected by the missing. The report calls upon the City of Toronto to partner with the board, the service, and our diverse communities to make Toronto a leader in how these cases are addressed. At the same time, my recommendations are designed to ensure that missing person investigations are done in an effective, timely, and discrimination-free way. As discussed in my report, this can only take place if the service also adopts a new approach to community engagement and partnership. I now speak to the important issue of implementation. I was encouraged by the overwhelming support my work received by the board and by the service. However, many people who spoke with me expressed the concern that my recommendations might never be implemented. That is why I have articulated a detailed implementation plan that involves community participation, regular reporting to the public on the extent to which the recommendations have been adopted, involvement of oversight agencies in monitoring implementation, and ultimately public accountability if the recommendations are not substantially implemented. My recommendations also address the robust civilian oversight the board should exercise, and they provide the board with the tools to do their work. I should add that my recommendations were inspired by the process of community leadership and engagement that led to this review and by my own community advisory group. Finally, I turn to cost. Any systemic review that makes significant recommendations for change must be mindful of cost implications. Many of my recommendations are cost neutral or involve modest implementation costs. That being said, some of the recommendations, particularly those that call for a new model for how missing person investigations are conducted, do require significant investment. I am well aware that these recommendations come at a time when there are pressures on the city and the board to reduce the services budget. There is pressure to reallocate those monies to communities to address a range of issues. I'm also aware that the pandemic has placed additional financial pressures on all levels of government to address the extraordinary reduction in revenues and the heightened expenditures the city has incurred during this period.
All right, we have just been listening, or we are monitoring, this news conference being held by Justice Gloria J. Epstein. She was looking into what happened with the victims of serial killer Bruce McArthur. She has concluded that there were profound systemic failures by police. She says that she has come up with 51 recommendations. This, of course, again, prompted by the investigation into Bruce McArthur. She said that the investigation was biased, that there was bias, discrimination, as well as preferential treatment, though no intent to discriminate. That was not the intention. She said that the system was flawed, and she wants to see a new focus put on policing and as well upgrading the missing persons investigation, as well as creating a centralized system into investigating people who are